Welcome to today's Starr Forum called Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World, a book talk with Shereen El Feki. Before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to remind everyone that we are recording today's event, so please, for the Q&A with the audience, line up behind the microphones on either side so we can hear you in the video. And I also wanted to mention that we do have one more Starr Forum coming up this year. It's going to be April 12th, or this semester, called On the Rocks, China and Japan in the East China Sea. And that will be a panel discussion including someone from the Chinese embassy and several other scholars. And also, we are selling books today. So at the end of the event, Shereen will be signing books, and they can be purchased outside. And in addition, we do have refreshments, so help yourself after the event to that. Shereen El Feki is a writer, broadcaster, and academic who started her professional life in medical science before going on to become an award-winning journalist for The Economist and a presenter at Jazeera English. She is former vice chair of the UN's Global Commission on HIV and Law and a TED Global Fellow. She divides her time between London and Cairo. Her newly released book, Sex and the Citadel, is a fascinating, groundbreaking look at changing sexual attitudes and behavior in the Arab world and their part in 2011's popular revolts. Joining the conversation today, we have Hilary Rantisi. And Ms. Rantisi is director of the Middle East Initiative at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. As director of this initiative, she has led in the development of multidisciplinary executive training programs that combine private, public, and civil society sector professionals from around the Middle East region. And under her leadership, this initiative has also increased its partnership with groups on and off campus to provide public education resources on the region. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
So it's an honor to host you here at MIT and to hear about your book. I read the book, and I think it's excellent, so a plug for all of you afterwards. Hopefully you'll pick up a copy and have it signed. Shereen, could you maybe give us just an overview of why you wrote this book, what motivated you to delve into this topic?
Absolutely. I just want to say thank you very much for coming out to this event. I know MIT and Harvard are places of temptation when it comes to intellectual stimulation, so it's great that you chose to come here. Last night I gave a talk at the Museum of Sex in New York. And then 3 days ago, I was on stage with a stand-up comic in LA. So this is certainly one of the most distinguished and august settings. So thank you very much to the Starr Forum for the invitation. Essentially, I set out to write this book for two reasons. One was personal, and the other is professional. So on the personal side, I am half Egyptian. My father is Egyptian. All my family live in Egypt. I carry an Egyptian passport. I am Muslim, but I grew up in Canada. And I never really thought much about my Arab heritage until September 11th. And the events of that day and the aftermath really stimulated me to want to understand, where do I come from? Who are these people that so much is written about? And I realized that I didn't need to rely just on what other people were saying, that I had a privileged access. And so I tried to reorient my career at that point. That I chose sex as my lens is, I appreciate, a little unusual. And the origin of that comes from my professional background in HIV/AIDS. So I have a doctorate in molecular immunology. I was healthcare correspondent at the Economist magazine, and part of my remit was writing about the global epidemic, and more recently my work with the United Nations on HIV and the law. If you look at HIV in the Arab world, you need to look at sex, because it is the primary mode of transmission. Upwards of half of cases, often 70–80%, of known cases of HIV in the Arab world are sexually transmitted. It hits women very hard. And sorry, just as an aside, for those of you who think that HIV is not a problem in the Arab world because we don't have these very high generalized prevalences, we have very concentrated HIV epidemics in all Arab countries right now. And in fact, there are only two parts of the world in which the numbers of new infections of HIV and the numbers of deaths from HIV are rising, and the Arab region is one of those places. And so as I began to look at sex, I really wanted to understand the taboos around sex and how they essentially impede the response to HIV. But then as I was doing that, I realized that actually beyond just sex itself, but looking at sexuality, so not just attitudes and behaviors, but sort of values and beliefs, were this incredibly powerful lens, if you like, in which to look at a society, because into our sexual lives comes politics and economics and religion and tradition and gender and generation. So it's an amazing instrument with which to probe a society. And at the end of the day, if you really want to know a people, start by looking inside their bedrooms.
Great. Well, you mentioned the taboo of discussing sex or talking about sex in the Arab world. As you're researching for this book, how did you get to have people open up? Was it difficult? What kind of reactions did you get when you told people what you're researching?
It was unexpected. So yes, you're quite right. The point of writing this book was to explore the taboo and the stigma around sex. And it's vast, and essentially the Citadel that I refer to in the book is the sense that there is only one socially accepted context for sexual life in the Arab world today, and that's marriage. And it's not just any old marriage. It has to be approved by your family, it has to be religiously approved, and it has to be registered with the state. And anything else is haram, forbidden, aib, shameful. There's an endless lexicon of reproof on these matters. But what the problem is that a large proportion of the population is outside the Citadel. And we can get into some of these groups, but it's a real problem. And societies acknowledge that these populations exist, but they really have no way of dealing with them. So given all that, it was actually surprisingly easy for me to talk to people about sex. And they opened up in the most extraordinary and unanticipated way. And I think that was for two reasons. One, because I have a connection to the region. I think people, particularly women, felt very comfortable talking to me because I knew where they were coming from. But because I look Western, I mean, I have the fair features of my Welsh mother, and frankly, my figure is more Arrow than Arabesque. And as a consequence of that, it was actually an advantage because many people in the Arab region have stereotypes of sexual life in the West, what they see through movies, on the internet, and they believe it is a place which is a free-for-all, and almost anything goes. And in a sense, that was quite helpful because they thought that I would not judge them. And that's one of the major impediments, particularly for women talking about sex, how you are going to appear to others. So I had this insider-outsider status, which could have been, detrimental, but actually turned out to be to my advantage. And I think to the advantage of the people to whom I spoke, because my problem was not getting people to talk, it was getting them to stop talking. Because there aren't that many opportunities for them to speak frankly, and people talk about sex all the time in private. In most groupings in the Arab world, women with women, men with men, but it's often not a terribly productive conversation because there's very little information available. So to be able to talk to someone who could also provide a modicum of information, I think that they found quite useful as well. So it was I think, a mutually beneficial experience.
Great. And most of your book focuses on Egypt, but you also have examples from many other Arab countries that you use maybe as a contrast. But why do you think Egypt was sort of the base, other than having maybe your family heritage there? And maybe you can tell us a bit more about your experience in Egypt versus other countries and why most of the book is focused on Egypt.
So Egypt is the historical fulcrum of the Arab world. It's the most populous country in the Arab region. It has, tremendous international geopolitical significance. It also has tremendous soft power. So through media, Egyptian movies, television series, and through migration, because millions of Egyptians are working outside, particularly in the countries in the Gulf, it has tremendous cultural influence as well. Now, what's interesting is that when I started this book in 2007, Egypt had pretty well been written off. And it was seen as the sort of dying diva of the Arab world, where it was mired in economic collapse and political corruption and stagnation and poverty and Islamism. And I was in Morocco, in Rabat, and my taxi driver said to me, with devastating simplicity, "Egyptians, so egotistical, and for what?" And the events of 2011 have changed that. And so people now look to Egypt. It has regained its sort of geopolitical mojo, if you like. And what happens in Egypt matters, because it really can have an influence on the rest of the region. So the collective sexual dilemmas I talk about in Egypt are found across the Arab region. If you can get solutions to work in Egypt, it is much easier to translate them to other parts of the Arab world. If you get something to work in Yemen, it's unlikely to work outside of Yemen. If you can get something to work in Egypt, you can take it to Yemen. You can see it working in Jordan, in many of the more conservative countries in the Gulf. You're right, I looked at other countries as well, because certainly there are other parts of the Arab region, as I said, they have the same problems, but they are a little more innovative in trying to tackle these issues. So whether it's a question of sexuality education in schools, or unwed motherhood, for example, or even questions of how do we find accommodation for people who engage in same-sex relations. And so I traveled across the region, had a look at what's happening there, how do they make it work, could it work in Egypt, and if we could get it to work in Egypt, then how would we take it on the road elsewhere?
Great. Throughout the book, you link the personal to the political. And maybe could you talk about how that manifests itself in many ways in the Arab world?
Yeah, I mean, the political and the sexual are the natural bedfellows. And you see it playing out certainly under the authoritarian regimes, the dictatorships that were deposed in 2011 and the ongoing process. So certainly in Egypt, for example, sex is a tool of control for the government. So we have laws which are regulating various aspects of sexuality, and you find that across the region. In most countries in the Arab region, premarital sex is illegal explicitly. Same-sex relations, sodomy, homosexual acts, variously defined, illegal. Abortion, highly restricted. So sex is very definitely a tool of political control. And that's in a legal sense, but it's also in an extrajudicial sense as well, because sex is a very potent tool of torture. And it's used routinely under the old regimes. We have there's the expression in Arabic, to break someone's eye, to humiliate them. And for example, sodomy has been the tool of choice throughout the ages for Arab governments. And sex is also used, for example, as an excuse for censorship. So very often you find that the excuse for internet censorship is to the morality, the sexual content. But in the process of doing that, you also hoover up political dissent as well. So that was then. What's happening now? Or rather, what's going to happen in future? And one of the things I look at the book is, if we want to achieve justice and freedom and equality and dignity and privacy and all these sort of fundamental principles of human rights, you need to embed them in personal life, and you need to put them in sexual life if you want them to stick in the public life, and the two are connected. And I can give you an example of this. It's live. All right, so young people in the Arab world, fantastic. Thank you very much, youth of the Arab world, for leading us into uprising and for spearheading the revolution. But yes, now sexuality education. No, I don't think we're going to trust you with information to really be able to lead your lives with any sort of responsibility or sense of tolerance for others, for diversity, or establish these sort of notions of equality within your personal life. No, we're not going to trust you with that. But I would argue that that's part, if you can, for example, through sexuality education and provide young people with the tools to make responsible decisions about their own sexual lives, personal lives, then that's going to affect their ability to interact on the political stage as fully informed and engaged citizens. So there's a real disconnect now between the political and the personal and the sexual. But I'm hoping that in the years to come, with efforts from various NGOs and other constituencies, that we might be able to close that gap.
Great. And you also talk about the role of economics and sex, as well as politics in all of this. Throughout the book, you mentioned the period of the infitah and how that impacted also life. Maybe if you could give us an idea of what infitah was and how it impacted people's lives in Egypt in a variety of ways in their personal life.
So the infitah is the opening, the economic opening that was introduced by President Sadat. You probably know these dates better than me, around 1974, it's mid-70s?
Mid-70s.
Mid-70s, yeah. In which the economy in Egypt had been highly controlled and largely nationalized under Nasser, and Sadat came in and started opening it up. But what happened in that opening up the Egyptian economy to the full force of global capitalism, there weren't the other economic reforms that are needed to actually give people, any chance of getting a job, for example, or gainful employment. So all you've done is created a very unbalanced system in which you have full exposure to consumer culture without the means of being able to access it. And this has all sorts of repercussions across the board. One of the most obvious one is sex work, which is thriving across the Arab world. In Egypt in particular, we have a form of sex work which is called the summer marriage, in which tourists come from the Gulf states in the summer to get away from the heat and humidity. They do a lot of shopping in Cairo. We love to shop. And one of the things that many of these male tourists buy are girls. And there is a whole network of brokers working out of villages near Cairo. They supply girls, and the families are complicit in this. The families are prostituting their daughters, effectively. You undergo a form of marriage. It's shara'i, it's Islamically, ticks all those boxes to make it Islamically sound, except, dubious intent aside. They have a relationship for a couple of weeks, could be months. The men go back and the girls go back to their homes. And they do this, several times a year. And the reason they do it is for economics. Some of these families are not desperately poor, but they want stuff. They see it on the television, they don't have the means of achieving it, and this is what they do. So that's a particular instance, but the much bigger economically driven sexual problem is that marriage has become very expensive in Egypt, because in Islam, men are enjoined to look after their wives, and that includes bearing the financial costs. And so it starts with the wedding, which is as big an affair as you can possibly afford, and it goes on from there. You have men has to buy the apartment, has to supply all sorts of appliances. There's a whole checklist that you have to provide, really, to get sign-off from your bride and the bride's family. Mm-hmm. As a consequence of this, married to the fact that jobs are very hard to get. Youth unemployment is running at 25-30% in Egypt, and it's a major driver of these uprisings. Young men can't afford to get married. And as a consequence, you have people who are having to wait to get married. Now, the Prophet, Muhammad, said that we should fast until we could marry. But he didn't mean fasting until you're 30. And so we have a real problem here, because these people are outside the citadel. Sex outside of marriage is haram. So what are they going to do? And the burden falls very, very heavily on young women in particular, because virginity remains a very big deal in the Arab world. And just one reflection of this. So it's very hard to ask questions in many countries about what young people are getting up to in their sexual lives, because you're not supposed to be having sex in the first place. And in Egypt, I was part of a national survey team, and we asked young people about, employment opportunities, their views of government, their leisure activities, and we wanted to ask them about sex. But the government prevented us. And this was under the Mubarak regime. So you can imagine what it would be like under the Muslim Brotherhood. Probably not going to be welcomed to ask those questions. But in places, in other parts of the Arab world where you can ask these questions, like Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria and Lebanon, you find a very interesting phenomenon. Upwards of about 30%, but it's usually 40, 50, 60% of unmarried young men will say, we have had relations before marriage. And then if you ask young women that question, less than 20% across the board will say that. Now that raises the obvious question, who are all these young men having sex with? The reality is that women are unable to really fess up to this, and has all sorts of consequences across the board.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, the Prophet and the role of religion throughout the book is also an important part of life in Egypt, in the Arab world. I think the perception from the West here of Islam is as being anti-sex, all sorts of sexual hang-ups because of Islam. Would you agree that this is the correct perception?
I think, in a sense, it is a correct perception because it's based on the interpretations, the mainstream interpretations today. So mainstream Islamist interpretations of Islam around sex are incredibly narrow, and incredibly narrow around the role of women. And that's not a surprise because it's a tool of control, basically. What's interesting in the long history of Islam is that we have had periods which have been so much more open on sexual matters. So the Prophet Muhammad, for example, used to talk extensively and in tremendous detail about aspects of sexuality, contraception, masturbation, anal sex. You name it, he would talk about it in a very frank, often quite funny and very humane way. And he used to talk about it so much that the medieval Christian critics of Islam used to point to that and say, how can this man possibly be a prophet? He is so sexed up. And you fast forward now, and then the critics of Islam are saying, what a sexually intolerant religion. And they're right. I mean, we have come to this incredibly narrow view of aspects of sexuality. And it's part and parcel of a general closing down that we have seen since the 19th century and has gained pace during the long years of autocratic rule, in which we have shut down on political thinking, economic thinking, social innovation, and sex is part of that closure. And we dress it up in Islam. We say that these conservative attitudes are mandated by Islam, but that's simply not the case. That between haram and halal, there is a wide spectrum of interpretation on a number of issues related to sexual life. We just choose now to go to the most conservative one. In ages past, there have been much more open readings.
It must have been really exciting to be in Egypt over the period of 5 years, and especially during the last 2 years, and seeing the changes and being part of the uprisings and the youth movements and all of that. Do you see the mobilization of young people, of all these groups that went out into Tahrir, as also being a force of change in terms of pushing agenda on sexual rights and freedoms and so on in Egypt? Or are we seeing now with the Muslim Brotherhood being in power that it doesn't translate necessarily into your private life necessarily, or at least in this realm?
I think it's not the Muslim Brotherhood that's the issue, or the Salafis who are the issue, because Egypt has been gravitating to much more conservative interpretations across the board, basically, for decades now. The interesting thing is, with the rise to political prominence of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Salafis, everything that was happening under the table is now on top of the table. And that's actually quite a good thing, because now we can start having an open debate, for example, of who speaks for Islam, what is the role of religion in public life, for example. We weren't able to have that under the old regime. I would have to say that for most people I've met, there is a real disconnect between the political and the personal. They really don't see the connection. And often I would ask young people, for example, okay, congratulations, you managed to get rid of the father of the nation. Now, could you go home and tell your own father where to get off? And the answer is no. Of course not. Just because we have deposed the head of state does not mean that the patriarchy has crumbled. It is alive and well. And I had a really interesting experience in Tahrir Square when I went down to talk to some protesters. And I asked them, do you think this is political freedom that you're fighting for could one day lead to personal freedom, and in particular, sexual freedom? And one of them, who was actually just taking a break from fighting the security forces down the street, was absolutely horrified. He told me, no, 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 no. The freedom we are fighting for is nothing to do with that. We are Arabs, we are Muslims, we believe in marriage, we want social freedom, we do not want sexual freedom. So just because they have liberal political standpoint doesn't make them liberal in other realms as we define liberalism in the West. And that's also true of women. Some women are certainly very progressive and see the connection, much more so than men, between the political and the personal. But a lot of them don't, and they are as staunch defenders of the patriarchy as anyone. But what I can say is, though, in the course of writing this book, I didn't want to just focus on problems. We know what the sexual problems are. I really wanted to look at the solutions. And what I found were these incredibly innovative people across the region who were taking charge and trying to solve problems, their sexual problems, whether it was at the level of the individual decision-making or these great NGOs that are trying to tackle a number of issues, like how can we get more space on abortion, for example. And I think that they have a better chance now than they did when I started the book. Because there is now a freedom of expression and a freedom of assembly in Egypt, but in many other countries. And there is a space for debate which didn't exist before. And as one of the innovators, a woman called Olfa Youssef, who is going back at looking at the Quran and reinterpreting texts, she said to me, it's not that talk changes things, but it is only through talk that things will change. And that's exactly what we now have space to do.
That's great. And I think your book hopefully will open up a space also for more discussion on these topics. I don't want to take up all the time here because this is also a chance to engage Shereen with your own questions. Maybe we'll open up the floor for some questions if you want to line up next to the microphones on either side. I can continue asking more questions, but I think Shereen has already given us a lot to think about, and hopefully sort of an appetizer about the book itself.
So there have been a lot of sexual changes in other societies over the last 50, 60, 70 years. Do those cultural changes have any relevance to what is likely to be going on in your part of the world?
Yeah, I mean, this question I'm often asked about this. Does the political revolution, is it going to entail a sexual revolution? Because that is the...
For example, in this country,
Yeah.
there was a lot of sexual change
Yeah.
in a short period of time.
Yeah.
Nobody really expected it particularly going on to it. Maybe some people did, but there was a lot of change. So is it possible to imagine, for example, that there would be a lot of change in a short period of time in your part of the world, or is that simply not likely at all to happen? Of course, we didn't think it was likely then either, but...
Yeah. I mean, the sexual revolution is obviously in the West is a product of a very particular history, and I know it's often seen like a helicopter. We went from taboo and stigma, and then it took off, and we were sort of sexually free or freer. But the reality is that the sexual revolution was like one of those, they call those Hercules transport planes, those big things, that you need to have a really long runway to get this thing off the ground. And that runway was actually established over centuries, in which you had political, economic, and social change in society, and that led to the takeoff. In the Arab world, we don't have a runway yet. And some people would argue we don't have a plane either. But I would argue that if we take off, we are not necessarily heading in the same direction. And I'd love to hear Hilary's perspective on this, but my feeling is that is not how social change happens in the Arab region. It's, frankly, it doesn't even happen that way politically. I mean, we haven't had political revolutions. What we have are new faces doing business as usual, only less effectively. And so my sense is that we're not going to see this dramatic break with the past in sexual life. I think we are going to see, we're certainly seeing changing behaviors. That's not an issue. The question is, can we see a changing attitudes and an open acknowledgement of those attitudes and finding a way to actually discuss them in the public domain? Because we need to be talking about these issues. And that's the real challenge. But I don't see a dramatic falling away. And one of the main reasons for that is the role of Islam. I mean, the sexual revolution in the West largely coincided with the sun setting on the influence of organized religion. And that is unlikely to happen in the years to come in the Arab world. Most people want to lead their lives within the parameters of Islam. The question is, how much freedom can you find within those parameters? And my book argues there's a lot more freedom in all domains, but particularly sexual life, than we're willing to acknowledge at this time. But I mean, Hilary, you have also looked at social change and social movements in the Arab region.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take on in terms of dramatic breaks, dramatic changes?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I think specifically on sexual life, personal life, changes are going to be very difficult and will be gradual, I think. On the political side, we see changes, but also it's going to be gradual. And as we were talking before about the expectation that maybe everything would change suddenly for Egypt and Tunisia and all these countries that are going through major transformations, but in reality it's a painful, slow change, and that's on the political side. I think from my look at social movements, at the mobilization of people from the ground, what gives me hope is that spark that people feel when they're personally empowered, and when they are empowered and feel that they can change things, they have agency. And that spark could dim easily, and people could get discouraged very easily. And I think keeping that spark alive, or remembering that spark to kind of motivate people to keep going for change, is eventually going to, I think, be what will bring people, but to bring real change in the region. On the personal life, I think it's much more complicated, and I think the role of religion and everything you said is going to make it look very different than in the West and the sexual revolution in the West. But also, I think looking at the numbers of youth in the region, that is definitely going to change personal life, family life, everything we're already seeing, and everything that you talk about in the book in terms of age of marriage, getting older, and so on, and how that's impacting life. I think that's only going to increase and going to push questions in society, and hopefully will eventually lead to positive change. But that would be my perspective on just the role of movements and in society. I have another question there.
Yes. How do you feel about the future of women in the Arab world? Let me explain. When I look at the old Kulthum recordings, I can see hardly a woman wearing a hijab.
Yeah.
Fast forward to the present, and you can hardly find a woman not wearing a hijab.
Mm-hmm.
I see that secularism in the Arab world, and many countries in the Arab world, is going down, and the religious fervor is engulfing the region, correctly or incorrectly. I mean, from Iran all the way to Algeria. Thank you.
Where are you from?
I'm originally from Iraq.
Okay.
And, I'm feeling very sad about the situation in Iraq also.
Yeah, I mean, the status of women, I mean, let's look specifically at Egypt, because it varies from country to country. But I mean, certainly we have seen retreat for women in a number of areas in Egypt. And it's not just with the rise of the Islamists. I mean, it's been that sort of trend, the conservative trend over the past few decades. So just to give you one measure of what's happening to women in Egypt. So we actually have very high female education rates now in Egypt. We have basically almost parity now at secondary school between young men and women. And upwards of 50% of young women, actually upwards of about 30 to 40% of young women are now going on to university in Egypt.